It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, a break from the routine, a chance to breathe in the crisp mountain air, and to feel the crunch of leaves under my boots. My friends, Mark and Jess, had talked me into joining them on a hike in the Appalachian Mountains, not too far from where we all grew up in West Virginia. I had been hesitant at first. I'm not much of an outdoorsy person, but they promised it would be fun, and after some persuasion, I agreed. Little did I know that this trip would change the way I saw these woods forever. The drive up to the trailhead was uneventful, filled with the usual banter, laughter, and a playlist that Mark had put together specifically for this trip. We arrived late in the afternoon and decided to set up camp near a small clearing. The sun was just beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The air was chilly, but we had a fire going in no time, and soon the cold felt like a distant memory. As the night deepened, Jess, with her usual enthusiasm, suggested we tell some scary stories. It felt appropriate, sitting by a crackling fire in the middle of the woods with nothing but darkness around us. Mark went first, sharing a story about some local legend involving an old cabin haunted by the spirits of Civil War soldiers. It was eerie, sure, but nothing I hadn't heard before. Jess then told a story about a missing hiker whose body was found weeks later, miles away from any known trail, with no explanation of how he'd gotten there. Again, creepy. But I had heard enough of those tales to not be too bothered. Then it was my turn. I didn't have a story to share. So I shrugged it off, saying, I don't know any good ones. But Mark wasn't having it. He grinned and said, all right, then I'll tell one more. How about the story of the Appalachian Goat Man? The what? Jess asked, leaning in closer, her face lit by the fire. The Goat Man, Mark repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's this old legend around these parts. Some say he's a shapeshifter. Others say he's the cursed spirit of a farmer who was turned into a creature by an angry god. He's got the body of a man, but the legs of a goat, and his head. Mark paused for dramatic effect. His head is a twisted mix of man and goat with these horrible glowing eyes. He roams these mountains, luring people deeper into the woods, imitating voices to trick them. Once you're lost, well, let's just say no one ever finds you. Jess laughed, but I could feel a chill run down my spine. I tried to brush it off as the cold night air, but there was something about the way Mark told the story that stuck with me. Maybe it was the way his voice seemed to drop an octave, or the flickering shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I shivered, wrapping my jacket tighter around me. Yeah, right, I scoffed, trying to keep my voice steady. That's just another campfire story to scare people. Maybe, Mark replied with a shrug, but I noticed he glanced over his shoulder into the darkness, his face briefly illuminated by the firelight. Or maybe it's not. We decided to call it a night not long after that. Jess and Mark headed into their tent, while I chose to sleep in my small, one-man tent a few feet away. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig. I told myself that it was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual sounds of the wilderness. But the thought of the goat man lingered in my mind. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound, a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, but not quite. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to determine if I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, closer this time. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, a mix of a human groan and an animal's bleat. I sat up slowly, my eyes straining to see through the thin fabric of the tent. The fire had burned low, casting only faint shadows. The forest was unnervingly silent, as if all the animals had sensed something and gone still. I waited, listening, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But then I heard it again, this time accompanied by the sound of something moving through the underbrush, coming closer to our campsite. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I scanned the clearing, my breath visible in the cold night air. I didn't see anything at first, just the dying embers of the fire and the dark shapes of the trees. But then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw movement, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. My heart leaped into my throat. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and what looked like the outline of horns or antlers protruding from its head. I blinked, convinced that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. "Mark? Jess," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. There was no answer from their tent, only the deafening silence of the night. I considered calling out louder, but something stopped me. An instinct, perhaps, or a deep-rooted fear that if I made any noise, it would draw the thing's attention. I stayed frozen, watching the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it moved. Just a slight shift, a step forward into the light of the dying fire. I got a better look at it now, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It had the body of a man, but its legs were bent backward like a goat's, and its skin was pale, almost gray, with patches of coarse hair covering its limbs. Its head, its head, was a grotesque mix of human and animal features with wide, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, straight into my soul. I felt a scream building in my throat, but I bit it back, too afraid to make a sound. The creature's eyes scanned the campsite, and then, to my horror, it began to walk toward my tent, its movements slow and deliberate, almost like it was savoring the moment. I backed away as far as I could, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold the flashlight. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to come closer. I glanced around, spotting a rock near the entrance of my tent. I grabbed it, knowing it wouldn't do much, but it was better than nothing. The creature was only a few feet away now, its eyes glowing brighter, and then it did something that made my blood run cold. It spoke. "Help me," it whispered, its voice a horrible mimicry of Jess's, but distorted, twisted, like it was coming from deep underwater. I froze, my mind racing. How did it know Jess's voice? Was it trying to lure me out? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to fall for it. I stayed silent, clutching the rock in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please, help me," it said again, this time sounding more like Mark. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The creature was playing with me, toying with my mind. I knew I had to get out of there, had to warn Mark and Jess, but the creature was between me and their tent. I was trapped. Then, without warning, it turned its head, sharply, as if it had heard something in the distance. For a moment it stood still, listening, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it darted back into the woods, its movements unnaturally fast and agile, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, stunned, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. I waited, listening for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to move. I crawled out of my tent and rushed over to Mark and Jess's tent, my hands still shaking. "Mark, Jess, wake up," I whispered urgently, shaking their tent. "What is it?" Mark mumbled, poking his head out, his eyes bleary with sleep. "There's something out there," I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something not human." Jess sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What are you talking about?" I told them everything I'd seen, every horrifying detail. Mark looked skeptical at first, but when he saw the fear in my eyes, he knew I wasn't joking. "All right," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "Let's take a look around." We stepped out into the clearing, flashlights scanning the trees. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it was holding its breath. "I don't see anything," Mark said, his voice trying to sound steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. Jess stood beside him, her flashlight beam darting from tree to tree, her expression tense. I swear, it was right there, I insisted, pointing toward the spot where I'd seen the creature. It had legs like a goat and eyes that glowed, and it spoke with your voices. Jess turned to me, her face pale. Maybe it was just an animal, or you were dreaming. No, I cut her off, my voice firm. I wasn't dreaming. I know what I saw. Mark sighed, glancing around again. All right, let's not jump to conclusions. But just in case, let's pack up and move camp. If there's something out there, we don't want to be here when it comes back. We quickly packed our gear, keeping one eye on the woods at all times. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made us jump. The moon was high in the sky, casting a ghostly light over everything. We decided to move further up the trail, to a spot we knew was a bit more open and less claustrophobic. Jess led the way, her flashlight swinging wildly with every hurried step. We walked in tense silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and our own ragged breathing. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, convinced I'd see those glowing eyes peering out at us from the darkness. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. After about 20 minutes, we reached a new clearing, slightly larger than the last. We could hear the faint trickle of a stream nearby. Mark looked around, nodding. This is better, more open. If anything comes, we'll see it coming. We set up our tents quickly, with nervous glances into the surrounding woods. I tried to keep my hands from shaking, telling myself over and over that maybe it was just a dream, just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen it, felt it. We built a small fire again, more for comfort than warmth. We sat close, our backs to each other, forming a tight circle, our eyes scanning the tree line. Nobody spoke for a long while. The fire crackled, the flames dancing, casting long, flickering shadows. Then, Jess broke the silence. So, what do we do if we see it again? Mark swallowed, his gaze still fixed on the darkness. We stay together. We don't let it separate us. And we don't trust anything we hear. We nodded in agreement. But then, almost on cue, we heard it. A faint voice calling from the distance. Help me, please. Help. My blood ran cold. It was Jess's voice, unmistakably hers, but distorted, stretched out, like it was coming from somewhere far away, and yet, somehow, right beside us. Jess stiffened. That's my voice, she whispered, eyes wide with fear. Mark shook his head, his face tight with concentration. Stay calm. Don't respond. It's trying to mess with us. The voice called again, louder this time, pleading. Please, I'm hurt. Help me. We all stood, backs pressed to each other, flashlights aimed outward, scanning the dark woods. The voice came again, but this time it was Mark's voice, frantic and desperate. I'm lost. Please, help me. Jess's hand gripped my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. Oh, God, it knows our voices. How does it know? Mark's jaw clenched. It's trying to scare us, trying to lure us out. We stay put, no matter what. The voices continued, alternating between our own, getting louder, more desperate, each one a perfect imitation, but somehow hollow, like it lacked a soul. My heart pounded in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard another sound. A low guttural bleating, almost like a goat, but much deeper, much more menacing. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee as far away from that sound as I could, but I forced myself to stay put, remembering Mark's words. Stay together. Don't let it separate us. The bleeding grew louder, closer, and with it a horrible scraping sound, like claws on stone. I tried to steady my breathing, but panic was clawing at my throat. I flashed my light into the trees, and for a split second, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes, far off in the distance. They blinked once, twice, and then disappeared. I saw it, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. I saw its eyes. Mark and Jess swung their flashlights in the direction I was pointing, but there was nothing now, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. The voices had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse, heavier. And then, without warning, something crashed through the underbrush just beyond the tree line, fast and heavy. We all jumped, spinning around, our flashlights flailing wildly. The noise was followed by a deep, guttural growl, a sound that sent chills straight to my core. "There!" Jess shouted, pointing to a spot just beyond the reach of our flashlights. I could barely make out a shape, a large, hulking figure moving among the trees, its outline distorted in the darkness. It was moving toward us. Mark grabbed a branch from the fire, the tip still glowing red. "Back off!" he shouted, waving the branch in front of him. "Stay away!" The figure hesitated, stopping just outside the circle of light. I could feel its eyes on us, watching, calculating. I could see it more clearly now. The twisted, unnatural limbs, the elongated face, half human, half goat, with large, curved horns that gleamed in the moonlight. Its mouth opened, and it let out a horrible, blood-curdling scream, a mix of human agony and animal rage. We all staggered back, fear gripping us like a vice. I felt my knees go weak, but I forced myself to stand, to hold my ground. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Mark didn't answer. He was focused on the creature, his face pale but determined. "We hold our ground," he said finally. "We don't let it think we're afraid." But I was afraid. More afraid than I had ever been in my life. My hands trembled, and I could barely keep hold of my flashlight. The creature took a step forward, and then another, its movements slow, deliberate, almost like it was testing us. Then, out of nowhere, it stopped and turned its head sharply to the side, as if it had heard something in the distance. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it bolted back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows with unnatural speed. We stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of its retreating footsteps, and then, finally, there was silence. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension in the air easing just slightly. What just happened?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark shook his head, still staring into the darkness where the creature had vanished. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I think it's gone. For now." We stayed close together for the rest of the night, huddled around the fire, our eyes never leaving the tree line. We didn't sleep, didn't speak much. Every little noise made us jump. Every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of fear through our bodies, but the creature didn't return. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up our camp in record time. None of us said a word about staying longer. We just wanted to get out, to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. We made our way back down the trail in tense silence, our eyes constantly scanning the woods around us. I kept expecting to see those glowing eyes watching from the shadows, but there was nothing, just the sound of our footsteps and the chirping of birds, oblivious to the terror of the night before. When we finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. As we loaded our gear into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, that those glowing eyes were still out there, waiting. We drove back in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I glanced back at the mountains as we left, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing among the trees. But there was nothing, just the thick forest stretching out into the distance. I haven't been back to those woods since that night. I'm not sure I ever will. The legend of the Appalachian Goat Man might just be a story, a tale to scare people around a campfire. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll never forget those glowing eyes or the way the creature called to me in the voices of my friends. It's out there, somewhere in those mountains, waiting for its next victim, and I hope to God I never see it again.